I'm going to be handing over shortly to Chris Hobbs, who's one of our practice consultants, who will take you through the majority of the presentation. But I would now just like to go through the agenda for everybody. We are starting a little bit late, just as we've been admitting people. I hope that's okay with you all. So introduction from me, obviously. We'll then be talking through the DA Act update and the myths in practice with Chris. We'll be taking you through a pioneer's journey, and this will be an audio life experience. A pioneer's journey from Sam. What does it mean for practice? This is going to be an interactive session, and then questions and close at the end. So just before we do that, I do want to just take you through our approach to domestic abuse here at Safe Lives. So our journey in terms of thinking about the whole system, the whole public health approach to domestic abuse started back in 2004 when there was a focus on a high risk framework, developing the IDVA and the MARAC and scaling up across the UK, supporting over 290 MARACs and training over 3,000 IDVAs. In 2014, there was a refocus on the whole family approach, developing Drive, One Front Door, and all the way through to local beacon sites of comprehensive best practice, all of which we can signpost you to through the information we will share and on YouTube. In 2018, we looked at a new whole picture strategy, which looking at the whole person linked to adverse experiences and all family members through multi-agency, cultural and systems change. And from 2020 onwards and into the future, building on our journey and delivering a whole picture approach to ending domestic abuse. At the end of the day, the whole person is never, domestic abuse is never all of someone's experience or situation. So it really is important that we think about the whole person, the whole family, the whole community, the whole society, and the whole picture. So I'm now going to hand over to Chris, who's going to take us through the rest of the presentation.
Started well, started himself on mute. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming here today. My name is Chris Hobbs. I'm a practice consultant within Safe Lives practice team. I've worked with children and young people for around 20 years in a variety of settings, including prisons, youth offending teams, children's homes, schools and children's social care. So we've got a variety of wide experience, and I've been asked to talk today about what the DA Act entails in relation to children and young people. And then we want to sort of focus on some practice elements, understanding of research, which hopefully should help sort of shape our services. And throughout we'll be sort of focusing on children and young people and what they say that they need, because I think that's the most important part of the work that we're going to be doing moving forward. I'm going to sort of talk about various pieces of research, both through Safe Lives and external as well, throughout the webinar. The links will be made available to you. They might be posted in the chat throughout as we go through the slides, but they'll be available alongside the recording, as Nikki sort of mentioned earlier on. They'll be available online later on. So the DA Act. The DA Act legislation states a victim of domestic abuse includes a reference to a child who sees or hears and experiences the effects of abuse and is related to the abuser or victim. So I want to pick that apart a little bit and just sort of get an understanding of what that might mean for us as practitioners moving forward. So a child is related to a person if that person is a parent of or has parental responsibility of the child, okay? And the child is related to a person if the child and the person are relatives. Now, there's other elements of that that sort of cross over. So a child means a person, any person under 18, and that's important to acknowledge, and we'll sort of talk through that later on. And parental responsibility has the same meaning as the Children's Act 1989, and the relative has the meaning given in the Family Law Act 1996. So it's just important to sort of cross-reference those pieces of legislation, just so it gives us a bit of an indication about who we might be speaking to and who we might be dealing with generally. Just to cover what the DA Act says about domestic abuse and what abusive behaviour might well be. It's listed as physical or sexual abuse, violent or threatening behaviour, controlling or coercive behaviour, economic abuse, and psychological, emotional, or other abuse. Okay, just to sort of update, just to sort of again cross that, the CPS follow this understanding of legislation by stating in their legal guidance that the DA Act sets out who can be a victim of DA behaviours and establishes how victims need to be connected to the perpetrator. Also makes clear that children, irrespective of whether they are injured or that they see the offending, are deemed to be victims of domestic abuse if they live in the abusive household. Okay, so just going back to that sort of that personal connectedness and that relationship, those relationships, it's really important to sort of understand who might play a role in this. So personal connectedness centers around two elements, one being a connected relationship from marriage or a civil partnership, or the second being a relative, which defined by the family law, which I mentioned a minute ago, means anyone from grandparents to uncles and aunties, from first cousins to civil partners. As I mentioned, a child is considered anyone under the age of 18. And when understanding parental rights and parental responsibility for those children, this includes all the rights, duties, powers, responsibilities, and authority which by law a parent of a child has in relation to the child and their property. That's taken from the Children's Act as well. Legally, a parent must provide a home, protection and maintenance for that child to develop, as well as being responsible for their education, their medical needs, as per the Children's Act and family law. Okay, so that's sort of where we're at with the personal connectedness and who the relationships might be for the children that we're going to be talking about today. When we're talking about children as victims, we're talking about them being victims of DA in their own relationships. So it's not just in families. We're going to be talking about them in their own relationships as victims where DA is perpetrated on a parent, so within the household, and DA directed towards children with no intimate partner violence element. Okay, so we're going to be covering all of those as we talk through what victims might look like. Just to sort of add, there's no requirement in the DA Act for the victim and the perpetrator to be cohabitating, which means absent parents who are notoriously overlooked in assessments need to be more included, more involved in those assessments moving forward. We will discuss a few other elements of the DA Act and one that sort of stands out massively for us sort of moving forward that will affect children on our practice. This one in particular includes revenge porn. And just to sort of go through a few stats really, if someone's nude or nearly nude images shared online, 62% of UK respondents felt that they were partly to blame for this. And that's the those sorts of attitudes that we're hoping to sort of talk about today. We're hoping to pick up on and work with moving forward. Specifically in relation to children, there was research done by the NSPCC and Middlesex University in 2016, which suggested 95% of children had seen explicit content online by the age of 14. And that again, we're going to be talking about healthy relationships later on, and that really will blur sort of the decision making when it comes to healthy relationships. And from a separate report that we've sort of had a little look at by Childline and the Internet Watch Foundation in 2013, 50% of young people said that they had received a sexual photo, and a third of those had received them from a stranger. So when we talk about sort of the disclosure of private sexual photographs, this is a real sort of key part of working with children and young people. 60% of young people in 2013 had said they'd been asked for images, and 40% had said that they created an image or a video, and 25% said that they had shared those. Now, that information has come from a 2013 study, so you can imagine we're 9 years on from that. So it's really important that throughout the work that we do in the DA Act, that we sort of tackle those sharing of images, because I think we could all agree that that's probably increased over the last nearly decade. And people speaking with strangers online, again, will have increased over the last decade. So it's really important that that element of the DA Act and that definition is sort of talked about moving forward in our services. So why have we seen a change? Historically, children who lived in households where domestic abuse was perpetrated were often considered indirect victims of abuse, and services, funding and research on domestic abuse, the effect on children has been reflected in this. So the new Act has given us the opportunity for children who are victims of domestic abuse to be treated with equal measure when it comes to decision making, service offer and understanding long-term effects. Regardless of commissioning cycles and funding, frontline services who support children who have been victims of abuse will, I think, ask to be more creative with the way that they work with the client group. Just going back to sort of the DA Act and the other elements that might affect children and will concern practitioners who are working with children who are victims of domestic abuse. There's the right to priority housing, coercion and control, which will help children who attend contact with perpetrators after separation, hopefully lowering the risk of becoming victims in post-separation abuse and that tug of war that often happens within a court arena, and the disclosure and threatened disclosure of private photographs, as mentioned earlier on. Local authorities have a legal obligation to prioritise and rehouse victims of domestic abuse, and this includes children, as described in the definition of a child earlier. So young people-based housing and safe accommodation is something local authorities should be looking into in order to in order to support that need alongside the change that we're looking at. The new DA Act also increases protections for families affected by domestic abuse under domestic abuse protection orders and the domestic violence disclosure scheme, which children will be a part of as well moving forward. The re-traumatisation of the court process for victims as an entity should be improved with this new legislation. Perpetrators won't be allowed to cross-examine their victims, whether they're victims of the abuse, as discussed earlier with that personal connectedness, or whether they're witnesses of domestic abuse in their household. And in addition to the law, there'll hopefully be a knock-on of effect into practice. Using Marek as an example, they're sometimes poorly represented by services supporting children. The addition to children being victims in their own right should improve not only the attendance, but also the advocacy and the actions for children at meetings such as Marek, which in essence we're hoping to lower the risk level associated with the domestic abuse in their relationship. We have learned a lot over the last few years, over the last decade, certainly around brain activity, brain trauma, and the consequences of domestic abuse. Studies from adverse childhood experiences, starting in America, and that has led us on to a variety of really useful practical examples, TED Talks, films such as Paper Tigers and Resilience, things that can really help practitioners sort of understand adverse childhood experiences and what they look like, and use them as a guide to their practice moving forward. There's also a lot more available trauma-related research for practitioners. So Bruce Perry has done a lot about understanding trauma and relationships. There's helpful studies from Dan Siegel about brain activity when in childhood, when feeling threatened. Gabor Mate's helpful walk through how trauma affects behaviour. All can give us a really good indication of how we can become more trauma-informed as services and improve our practice with children who've been affected by domestic abuse. We know more about the wiring of brain synapses as well, which is really key to understanding that sort of threat. We're now aware that you can be as affected by the perceived threat of trauma as much as the actual threat of trauma. And this will enable us to focus the new legislation that tells us children are victims, even if they're not physically harmed. So we really need to get that indication of what's going on for children before the physicality of violence in the home and in their relationships. Children notoriously engage with services who treat them with respect, empower decision-making, work with the child, develop healthy relationships, and who help heal their traumas using language that is relatable and practitioners who are patient, non-judgmental and understanding. Whole family assessments will be key moving forward. I think it's important that we acknowledge whole family assessments to reducing the barriers to engagement, because the legislation's recognition that the whole family can be affected in the household by domestic abuse. Recognising the child's voice, I'm going to talk more about that later on, within these assessments is really, really important moving forward. A useful tool that I found over sort of my experience working with children that have been through traumatic events has been the trauma recovery model, which was developed by Scouse and Matthews in 2014. It's a little bit like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but it gives us a good indication of trauma, the underlying need of trauma, and the layers of intervention associated with the behaviours that we might be seeing with children and young people who've been affected by trauma and by abuse. And that enables us a wider picture of what type of support to offer and at what stage, because what we do understand around victims and around survivors, from what they tell us, is that every experience is individual, and we really need to understand that from the child's point of view as well. Okay. So through Safe Lives Practice Team, we've done a lot of public health work around the country, and I just want to talk you through some of the information that we've found over the last 18 months, really, when we've been doing the public health work around the country. This is specifically related to children and young people. So nearly three quarters of practitioners surveyed felt that they were confident in challenging professionals in other agencies to ensure that children were seen as victims in their own right. Okay, that's really important to acknowledge, that there is a confidence around practitioners, around challenging other professionals, and that's really good when we look at culture of practitioners across the country. What we do need to sort of become to recognition is that only half of the practitioners, of the same practitioners that were surveyed, said that they were trained in specific domestic abuse and how it affects children and what that looks like moving forward. So there's quite a big sort of discrepancy there in the confidence in what we actually understand children and domestic abuse going through. We know that there needs to be an improvement in the response to children as victims, and training is one of the most important areas to start with that. Practitioners require updating on safeguarding, contextual safeguarding, risks for children, safety planning for children, recognising child trauma responses and behaviour and what that looks like, what that's presented as, being trauma informed, and working on legislation, what comes out and what's changed over recently. And all this should be sort of incorporated into the training for practitioners and should be part of any commissioning moving forward as well. Some further areas, some further relevant sort of information from the public health work that we've done over the country finds that there is a bit of an inconsistency with the support that's on offer and what that looks like. So what does that look like for young people and what does that feel like for young people? In some areas of the country, there's a fantastic response. These have mainly been built on quality relationships and usually works creatively with successful outcomes for the children and families. These responses, are usually whole family orientated, have consistent partners in that relationship, and they engage with families showing a good sort of mix of understanding of risk, empathy, and empowerment. We've also found that it's not just a lack of services in some areas, so it's not just a lack of service provision in some areas, but a lack of quality trained practitioners that might come into contact with children and young people as domestic abuse victims. So it's not just that the services don't exist, it's that some of the services that have complex referral pathways might have huge waiting lists. And one of the aspects certainly that we found is with regards to sort of mental health, and as you can see, a couple of quotes from survivors that we've worked with on the public health approach talked about that. And from my own experience as well, young people have really said that seeing mental health practitioners can be really, really useful for them, for helping them develop resilience, for helping deal with traumas that have affected them. But also young people say that they have a desire to connect with a practitioner and build a robust relationship with a practitioner, people that they know that they can trust, people that they know they can be transparent with, and people who they know they'll be supported with. And those relationships are often built on longevity. Frontline practitioners can and should be equipped to deal with disclosure. They should know their routes and referrals into services that will support disclosure, and children say consistently that they feel that they can trust on. If they feel they can trust and rely on a practitioner, they are more likely to be open and honest about their relationships and about any issues that they might have moving forward. Just want to touch on some of the work that Safe Lives have been doing outside of the public health work across the country. We've done some work around And this is also on our website. There's work that's been done around talk about toxic and your best friend work. So I'm going to touch on some of the research there, and then again some more external research moving forward. So there's been some interesting views and attitudes in relation to domestic abuse, and I know that pie chart's probably quite small on your screen, but the talk about toxic research has helped us understand that young people don't use the term domestic abuse. When viewing relationships that they feel are unhealthy, they're more likely to use the term toxic or harmful. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that when thinking about the accessibility for young people, for starting up service provision, for sort of advertising our service provision. They don't really look at what domestic abuse is. They don't use that term. And if you can see the pie chart, domestic abuse is only 2% of the understanding about unhealthy relationships. Toxic and harmful is the language that they use as young people. We can also see from the Your Best Friend project that there's a lot of young people who won't interject into unhealthy, harmful, or toxic relationships unless someone in that relationship is physically harmed. That's really important to acknowledge as well, especially with the new legislation, including coercion and control. The young people are more aware of what these behaviours look like, what they sound like, how they make people feel, and they need to be aware of the nature of those relationships. As we already know from research into domestic abuse, the physicality of domestic abuse rarely just happens per se. More that there's often a build-up of controlling, stalking or manipulative behaviour that precedes the physicality and the violence. Children and young people services need to be aware of this language from Your Best Friend that's sort of talked about, and adapt their services as they see fit. When talking about accessibility as well, it's really important to gather the evidence as to what hasn't worked and listen to survivors' views. So Scotland's Voices Unheard project, which spoke to LGBT young people, found that 50% had been in abusive relationships, but only 37% of those had recognised that as abuse. This study also found that around half of victims and survivors wouldn't feel comfortable coming into services because they'd feel judged or oppressed, and they wouldn't get the specialist support that they felt it required, or they required. This again leads us into a question about how do we make ourselves more accessible to victims, and how do we reach out to those victims that are invisible? How do we make them more visible, and how do we make ourselves more visible as well? And finally, when discussing relationships that were violent in a Bristol-based study, they found that 50% of girls in relationships felt physical violence was wrong, and only 30% of boys did, which leads us a little bit into understanding more about young boys' experiences of acceptable views on partners, on females, and on relationships within and violence within relationships. When we look at these studies and we review the understanding that children are our victims in their own right, we need to consider a lot of different aspects to the children and young people's offer. It won't be enough to just employ a few more social workers or youth workers, put on a few additional assemblies in schools. We must look at how we can adapt the services that we've got to become more accessible, more child focused, and using the correct language aimed at the additional barriers young people face both in more of a digital age, but also in a very complex relational age and a complex age as well. So the differences, sort of complexities in the age-related behaviours. So I want to just quickly touch on the differences that we might see in these groups of people, to enable our focus of support for children as victims and young people as victims. It's useful to understand and take into account that it's not just adults, it's not just children. There's a variety of different complexities throughout childhood, adolescent, and the older teens as well in their development. It's useful when considering how we're going to move or adapt our services to cater for children as victims, to understand differences on the effect of domestic abuse. And this has been taken from Bernardo's, but if you just look at some of the differences, and there's some that are very similar as well. You've got 0 to 2-year-olds who might be stressed or dysregulated. You've got 2 to 5-year-olds that might be quite anxious, and that's somatic pain. So a lot of my tummy's hurt. What's that look like? Regressions in speech and language, or toileting. In 5 to 10-year-olds, you've got that isolation or that feeling of shame and low self-esteem, which is really, really sort of important to 5 and 10-year-olds, a real key time for developing friendships So that, that can be something to see as well. And 10 to 19-year-olds, they can be that escape through risky behaviour. We see that quite a lot. And they can take on the behaviour of the perpetrator or the victim, and they might internalise a model of intimate relationships. They can self-harm, and they might be quite fearful generally in how they move forward. And it's really important to acknowledge that this isn't an exhaustive list. As we are aware, trauma is individualised. Domestic abuse victims and survivors talk about how their individual journey happened, and we're going to listen to some of that. Being responsive requires an individual plan and an individual risk assessment for each child and their families. We must all be looking at non-visible cues that children and young people might have. So we're looking at things like changes in routine, excessive needs for control, cleanliness, changes in appearance, those types of things. And it's in this regard that consistent relationships at schools, as an example, are of huge value, citing hidden changes, being curious, asking the right questions, being in tune with children who are victims of domestic abuse, but aren't visible victims necessarily, are such important aspects of these relationships. So the final little bit from me is we spoke to it's sort of regarding myths that children may face with regards to that service provision and what it looks like, and the impact on them and how we can shape the landscape moving forward when we're looking to the future of our young people's services. We spoke to pioneers throughout Safe Lives and asked them what they thought the barriers and the myths to surrounding children as young people and victims are, what they might be, and what their response. And we had a little look at research alongside this as well. So we've got 5 myths that we're going to sort of just quickly, briefly sort of touch on. So the first one is children not impacted by the abuse if they did not experience it directly. So our pioneers said children will always be impacted by DA in their family, whether they experience it directly or not. Children do not witness abuse. They experience it as victims in their own right. They may feel guilt, shame, and fear, and this can only have a long-lasting effect on them. It's also very unlikely that they won't have seen what's going on, either at the time or the aftermath of that. Abuse is not single incidences that can be hidden away. It's an ongoing pattern of behaviour that impacts every aspect of our lives. And when we looked into some of the research for that, there's statistics to back this up. So exposure to domestic abuse causes serious physical and psychological harm to children, as measured by the children's caseworkers at intake. 52% had behavioural problems, 60% felt responsible for negative events, half had problems with social development and relationships, and 39% had difficulties adjusting at school. It's really important to acknowledge, and that was before that sort of research was done before the DA Act and moving forward. And the myth that the abuse ends for children when the relationship ends, and there's 2 lots of research that back this up. So our pioneers said for the relationship, for a child, the relationship never ends. They often have no control over this. There may be contact sessions, which they feel guilted into going to, even if it continues to be unsafe. Even in the minority of cases where there's actually no ongoing contact, the child will continue to have feelings of guilt. They may love their parent and they may feel that the abuse was their fault. They may struggle to come to terms with what their parent did, and they may feel torn between their parents. There's research, and abusers will continue to use children as a tool to continue the abuse, and we have seen that throughout sort of court reports and CAFCAS, stuff like that. And some of the research, one was from CAFCAS and one from the NSPCC, said the evidence in qualitative sample of children having experienced domestic abuse and harmful parental behaviour, such as excessive drinking or violence, in their parents' relationships, children had experienced physical and verbal abuse, and some children being injured. For some children, this had continued into parents' subsequent relationships. So once the relationship between parents had been moved on and they'd gone into new relationships, that continued abusive behaviour was witnessed. And from the NSPCC, sometimes when parents are separated, there is a court order in place that sets out who the child lives with and has contact with. We heard from some parents and carers who felt the need to comply with the court order was stopping them from taking action to keep their children safe from domestic abuse. So when the relationship ends, the abuse definitely doesn't end. And post-separation abuse is something that we really need to be very aware of. We need to be tailoring our services to encapsulate that, so not closing not closing cases when parents split up, or dad might go to prison or mum might go to prison, whatever the relationship looks like, not closing cases at that point, because post-separation abuse is very serious and it's very harmful to children and young people. Another myth is that children will do well at school, having not and not be impacted by the abuse. And there was some research that talked about hypercompliance and how important it is to be aware of hypercompliance. And I understand that there'll be some people from education on here that will see hypercompliance in their classrooms, and it's really important to just be curious about that if you've got some underlying sort of awareness of the families already. Just be quite aware of hypercompliance. Our pioneers said overachieving in some areas of life can be a coping strategy. School might feel like a safe space, and there might not be obvious signs that abuse is happening within the family. And research also backed this up, saying especially in cases like recurring childhood abuse, narcissistic abuse, or domestic partnership abuse, where trauma is repeated, sustained, and hinges heavily on victim blaming, hypercompliance is common. It's something that we really need to be aware of, and those hidden presenting behaviours we really need to be aware of, as we sort of discussed earlier. The impact on children will not be severe or long-lasting was another myth. So our pioneers said the DA can have long-lasting impact on children, causing issues with relationships, anxiety, physical and mental health issues, all the way into adulthood. Even for those children who appear resilient at the time, long-lasting damage is done, and this may not be apparent until much later on in life. So again, masking those behaviours and what that might look like. Research said, and this is from the effects of trauma by Mind, common mental health impacts long-term may include, but not limited to, flashbacks, panic attacks, disassociation, hyper and hypo-arousal, sleep problems, low self-esteem, grief, self-harm, suicidal feelings, substance misuse, guilt, self-blame. And studies suggest that trauma could make you more vulnerable to developing physical health problems, including long-term or chronic illnesses. When we talk about hyper and hypo-arousal, it's really, really important to sort of understand what that looks like in the children. And that presentations are very different in each child, and trying to work with keeping them in the window of tolerance. There's some work done by Beacon House, who talk a lot about the window of tolerance and what that looks like. Some absolutely wonderful videos by Beacon House, and that can give us a really good understanding of how we can keep children in their window of tolerance and what hyper and hypo-arousal might look like moving forward. So again, another really important sort of myth to move on with. The last myth that I want to sort of just touch on is that children and young people who live in abusive households go on to be perpetrators in future relationships. And one of our pioneers said, I lived in an abusive household. I was affected and I relived the trauma regularly, but I've developed coping mechanisms throughout healthy relationships and through therapy, which both support me. And the research goes alongside this. Being a child victim of domestic abuse actually makes you more likely to be a victim of adult domestic abuse rather than a perpetrator. Those who survived more than one type of child abuse were more likely to experience domestic abuse as an adult than those who have survived fewer types of child abuse. So the analysis found survivors of four types of child abuse were more likely to suffer domestic abuse. 77% have experienced domestic abuse at the age of 16, compared with 40% who had experienced only one type of abuse as a child. And that information comes from the ONS. So they're just some of the myths, just to help us really think about what our services and our provision can look like moving forward. I'm going to hand over firstly to a recorded pioneer statement, and then to our second pioneer, Sam, who's going to give her story. But I just want to sort of read out a confidentiality statement from this. So we're privileged today to hear the words as a survivor who is a survivor of domestic abuse in childhood. Sorry, words mixed up. Catherine has written this piece, which has been spoken by our Authentic Voice coordinator, Gemma Gall. It does cover traumatic subjects, so including child sexual abuse and self-injury. It's around 6.5 minutes long, So you might want to mute if this is a bit of a trigger warning, really. You might want to mute yourself over the next sort of 6 or 7 minutes, and I will switch to the next slide and introduce Sam, sorry, in a minute, and we can move. Then you can see that it's moved on after this. So I'm going to play. This is an audio recording. I'm going to play Catherine's story to you. It is a little bit quiet on the recording, so you might want to turn if you can turn your computer volume up, then you might want to do that now. I'll play Catherine's story for you.
When I tell people that I was sexually abused by my older brother, I always say that it started when I was 8. And he was 14, but really I have no idea when it started. I can't really remember a time before the abuse, except for maybe the old house. I always hated the new house. It was so different from the old house. Not just the actual house, but everything it represented. Everything seemed to change when we were forced to move. My dad had run up huge drug debts, and the sale of the house funded his habit. The new house had no garden and was on a busy road far away from all my friends. In the old house, my mum had stayed at home with us, but in the new house she had to work full time, and I was looked after by my older brother. I've always felt like the domestic abuse we experienced from my dad provided a backdrop to our lives. It was always there, even when things were going well. We always knew that things could change in an instant depending on what mood he was in. Ourselves and each other. There are a couple of memories I have that have entwined themselves together, and I struggle to separate them. One that I remember as being a really exciting and funny story to tell about my dad to shocked friends as I got older, and one that is just sad and seemed like the very beginning of the lifetime of self-destruction that would follow. In the first, my dad has woken me up in the middle of the night to tell me he loves me and not to be sad. He must have broken into the house because he didn't live with us then. I can remember exactly how I felt when he woke me up. Not frightened or upset, just resigned to here we go again. I was only around 9 or 10, still at primary school, but it had happened so many times already. I was just wanted to roll over and go back to sleep, which I did. The next morning when I got up for school, there was blood all over the living room, on the chair, on the mirror, and on the carpet. The phone had gone missing, and the chairs had been slashed with a knife. My mum had to go to the phone box to call the police. 4 police cars arrived and a police van with dogs all lined up outside our house. They called in a police helicopter as there was so much blood they thought my dad must be dying somewhere in a ditch. I can really remember finding the phone down one of the slits in the chair, and that the police really praised me. I think they were worried he would come back with a knife and we wouldn't be able to ring them. They never found him that day. I knew they wouldn't. Even at that age, I had known that this was all for show, a grand gesture from my mum. Look what you made me do. It was a story he loved to tell too, how he escaped from the police dogs and a police helicopter. In reality, he rang his dad, who took him to the hospital to have his wrists bandaged up. The other memory was a bit later. I was 12. It was a normal Sunday. My dad always came to see us on a Sunday. After they split up, he insisted that my mum let him come on Sundays and Christmas Day. She didn't have much choice. If she said no, he would turn up anyway and break the door down or stand in the street screaming at her through the letterbox. Some days he sat on a wall across the road for hours and hours, just watching us, so mostly we let him in. This day was like most of them. He sat on the couch all day drinking and watching us. He never played with us or even talked to us really. He would watch and we would tiptoe around him, trying not to be the one who said the thing that might make him explode. I can remember the tension in the air this day. Odd comments here and there that showed us what mood he was in and put us on an extra heightened alert. But nothing happened. As the day went on, the inevitable thoughts of how do we get him out would start and what time would he go. He might say he was going to get a particular bus and we'd all be desperate for him to start getting his stuff together to go. Then he'd miss the bus. It went right past our house. And we'd start again, hoping he'd get the next one. At about 6 p.m, I was curled up on my mum's knee watching TV, and he was still there, sitting on the couch, still just watching us. He hadn't spoken to us for hours, and we knew something was coming, but not what or when. Suddenly, without making a noise, he threw the glass of wine he was holding across the living room at the fireplace. It shattered into hundreds of tiny pieces and made a noise like an explosion. I started screaming and screaming and screaming and couldn't stop. I don't think my dad knew what to do. He'd been building up to this for hours and my reaction confused him. I started to hyperventilate and ran from the house to the local churchyard where I morbidly liked to hide. I calmed myself down eventually and went back. My mum had cleaned up the mess and managed to get rid of my dad. The house was in order again, like nothing had happened. The next day when I got home from school, I cleaned out the fire ready to light it before my mum came home from work and found a small fragment of glass that my mum must have missed when she cleaned it out. I picked it up and stared at it and held it to my arm. That was the first time I cut myself. I felt instantly better, in control for the first time ever.
Abuse is. First question, no, 228 responses to that, and climbing in terms of no, 57 yes and 16 I don't know. And that's a really interesting question. And I guess when you listen to Sam's presentation about trying to understand the circumstances that you are in at the time, that is really, really difficult. So I guess, again, it goes to what we've been talking about today and thinking about how we support and work with children that may be experiencing domestic abuse. And again, maybe that's also about thinking more and more about how we can integrate people's lived experience, but also the different range of resources. Some we will share, things that we've been doing as well with Safe Young Lives and Your Best Friend, relevant resources that may help to support sharing that information and gaining that understanding. Sarah, do we have any of the other results through to any of the other questions yet? Question 2, how can we support and raise awareness of what domestic abuse is? And I guess if you kind of look at some of the successful campaigns that are out there, Stop Smoking, a really good example of that, but also kind of thinking about other ways in which communities have been reached, how we reached communities within the pandemic, different places within different communities like fishing or farming and other places, and where people identify in terms of the places, not just where they live, but perhaps some of their hobbies and those things that they engage with. So you've also given us some great things to think about there: school assemblies, training, healthy relationships, education, education coming up more than once, training again, and certainly within education, within our public health results, we saw that training within education was very low in terms of things like 97% of probation, but actually under 50% within education. So that ongoing development of and places that schools are as hubs in the community. So where else are there hubs? I mean, we have the early help hubs. How do we integrate more conversation within those? Talking openly about it, the media. So lots and lots of suggestions there for us to think about, and not for us to just think about nationally, but how do we integrate that into our thinking at a local level, particularly now with the integrated care boards and integrated care systems, where there may be more opportunities to think across the system. How can we use all of those channels to reach where people are? So working with children in school from young ages, the types of terminology we use, absolutely. And we keep talking about it all of the time, absolutely. Thank you. So we'll collate all of these and again, we'll share all of these results with you so that it can start to feed into the way that you're thinking and talking about it with the colleagues that you work with and the victims and survivors that you work with. And within your service, are you able to complete whole family assessments? So 51% saying, or it's up to 60 saying, sorry, 60 people saying yes and rising. But actually, interestingly, they're quite a even split, which is interesting. Now more to the no than the yes. Be really interesting to explore the issues around some of that at another time. Love to have another hour to talk about all of that at the moment. Thank you for sharing that. And that may be, you know, it'd be lovely to perhaps have a conversation or a bit of a round table with some of you with some of these results more broadly at another time. What are the barriers you find to completing the whole family assessment? Obviously, we're not going to capture everything here, but might help us think about another conversation that we could have with you with some kind of more deep dives. So consent, job remit, assessing children. We don't work with children, just victims. Obviously, children are now a victim in their own right. So how can we think about that differently, which may link to another point here around how services are funded, working in strategic roles, not client facing, policy, families worried to tell the truth, lack of services, time constraints. Assessing health of looked after children, so unable to see all the family. Engagement from all family members, workers, willingness, time, caseloads are very high, and obviously we are in the system seeing that continue to grow at the minute, especially with the backdrop of the cost of living crisis adding to this as well. So we don't work with the abusive parent, not enough staff to work with the children. And obviously, again, we know that there is a workforce crisis at the minute across most sectors. So again, all of these things will be further impacting. Victim focused agency, work with the victim and therefore not all of those involved with the family. Willingness to engage and consent. Be also interested to know how that is with where there perhaps are older people in the family as well, or you with working with intergenerational, but also children that perhaps without capacity or thinking about with learning disabilities and additional communication needs and complexity. So and again, this might be all suggestions for further webinars we do when we're thinking about children as victims under the Domestic Abuse Act. Have you changed your practice with children, young people with the Domestic Abuse Bill became law? So just those responses now coming in. Just wait for those to settle a little bit. Appreciate we've got only 10 minutes left on the webinar, so thank you so much to everybody for joining us on this part. It really is important. It does help us to think about how we shape further webinars and how you might like to engage with us around certain topics. And I did put in the chat as well, hopefully to help inform some of this conversation, we will be publishing our report on a whole system approach to ending domestic abuse and what we've learned in the past 2 years from doing our work with across 40 local authorities. So yes, yes, 87, no, 110. Thank you for that. If we can just, thank you. Sarah's good at preempting now. What is it you've done, how and why? I need preempting most of the time, I think. So reviewed policies and pathways, no change. No change to funded remit. I think that's something that it is something we need to think about in terms of commissioning and how to do things differently. Key work sessions with children, social workers who focus on children's resources, children's working group. Key work for children in refuge, no training given for staff, unfortunately. Some where there is no change, lack of guidance for police forces and redesigned services, making clear reference to children as victims, funding capacity and training. I think that, unsurprisingly is a theme across all of our work and that we've been doing with the public health approach, but also some of the, questions we've been posing with you today.